Good evening, let's talk about something cheerful. The slow, creeping, and frankly terrifying rise of modern fascism. Now I know what you're thinking. Oh great, another over-the-top comparison. But stick with me here, because while the United States and China look about as different as a bald eagle and a panda, their political trajectories are starting to rhyme in some deeply unsettling ways. On one side of the Pacific, you have the star-spangled spectacle of American political theater, and on the other, the meticulously choreographed control of the Chinese Communist Party. Yet, beneath the surface of these wildly different systems, a similar poison is at work. Elites in both nations are mastering the dark art of using fear, nationalism, and blame to keep their grip on power. This isn't a simple story of good versus evil or democracy versus communism. It's far more complicated and frankly far more depressing. It's a story of how working people in both countries are being squeezed by economic forces far beyond their control, only to be told that their real enemies are each other. The anger is real, the pain is genuine, but the targets are carefully selected by those who benefit most from the division. We are witnessing a global trend where ruling classes, whether they wear business suits or party uniforms, have figured out that a population divided against itself is a population that cannot challenge the status quo. It's a cynical and effective strategy, and it's playing out on the world's two biggest stages. The core of this unsettling convergence lies in the consolidation of power. In the United States, we've just seen the inauguration of a second Trump administration in January 2025, stacked with more billionaires than a dragon's treasure hoard. This isn't just about tax cuts anymore. It's about a new tech-industrial complex rewriting the rules of the country itself. Meanwhile, in China, Xi Jinping has cemented his rule, transforming the country into a high-tech surveillance state where dissent is not just punished, it's preemptively erased by algorithm. Both leaders have, at times, expressed a strange sort of admiration for the other's methods of control, which should be a five-alarm fire for anyone who values freedom. So how did we get here? How did the supposed beacon of democracy and the world's largest totalitarian state start mirroring each other's worst tendencies? The answer involves a complex cocktail of economic decisions, historical grievances, and carefully manufactured myths. It's a story about how the promise of global prosperity left millions behind, creating a fertile ground for resentment that leaders were all too happy to exploit. It's a story of how fear becomes a political tool, and how ordinary people are tricked into fighting proxy wars for their own ruling elites. It's a story we desperately need to understand if we want to find a way out. Let's turn back the clock to 2001, a simpler time. The biggest tech worry was your dial-up connection dropping, and the idea of a reality TV star becoming president was, well, still a joke. In December of that year, China officially joined the World Trade Organization. This was hailed as a landmark achievement, a moment that would knit the world closer together through the magic of commerce. The promise was simple: American consumers would get cheaper goods, and Chinese workers would get a pathway out of poverty. On the surface, it seemed like a win-win, a beautiful symphony of global capitalism where everyone gets a trophy. But as we now know, that's not quite how it played out. For China, joining the WTO was like strapping a rocket engine to its economy. It became the world's factory, churning out everything from iPhones to garden gnomes at an astonishing rate. Its GDP per capita skyrocketed from just over $1,000 in 2001 to over $10,000 by 2019. But this explosive growth came with a catch. The wealth didn't trickle down evenly. It was captured primarily by the state and a new class of party-connected elites. By 2010, household consumption as a share of the economy had fallen to a shockingly low level, meaning ordinary Chinese families weren't reaping the full benefits of their own hard work. The system was designed to enrich the powerful, not to empower the people. Meanwhile, back in the United States, the other side of this bargain was turning sour. The flood of cheap imports did, in fact, lower prices at Walmart, but it also decimated American manufacturing. The China shock, as economists call it, wiped out millions of factory jobs, hollowing out entire towns and communities across the Midwest and the Rust Belt. For the workers who lost their livelihoods, this wasn't some abstract economic theory, it was a personal catastrophe. Their skills became obsolete, their pensions vanished, and their sense of purpose was shattered. This widespread economic devastation created a deep well of anger and despair, a political powder keg just waiting for a match. And so, the great WTO experiment created two very different yet connected forms of profound social stress. In China, it fueled a state capitalist machine that prioritized growth and control over the well-being of its citizens, leading to massive inequality and a fragile economic model built on debt and speculation. In the United States, it created a displaced and resentful working class that felt abandoned by its leaders and betrayed by the promise of globalization. In both countries, this economic pain laid the groundwork for the rise of leaders who promised to restore national pride and punish the supposed enemies responsible for their people's suffering, setting the stage for the dictatorial turn to come. When a large number of people are hurting economically, they tend to get angry. And when people get angry, they start asking inconvenient questions like, why am I working harder for less? Or why did the bank that tanked the economy get a bailout while my house was foreclosed on? This is a dangerous moment for any ruling elite. So, what do? You perform a magic trick. You take that legitimate anger and with a bit of misdirection and a puff of nationalist smoke, you redirect it away from the powerful people at the top and onto a convenient scapegoat. It's a classic move, and both American and Chinese leaders have become grandmasters of the art. In the United States, the narrative spun by figures like Donald Trump was masterful in its simplicity. The reason your job disappeared wasn't because of complex global supply chains or corporate decisions to maximize profit by moving production overseas. No, it was because of China, and it was because of immigrants. These external forces, they claimed, were cheating, stealing American jobs, and weakening the nation. This message resonated powerfully with those left behind by deindustrialization. It provided a clear enemy and a simple solution: build a wall, start a trade war, and make America great again. It cleverly shifted blame from domestic policy failures and corporate greed onto foreigners, dividing the working class along lines of nationality and race. China's ruling party, the CCP, plays a remarkably similar game, just with a different set of villains. As its own economic model started to falter by the 2020s, with a collapsing property market, soaring youth unemployment, and slowing growth, the party needed to explain why the promised prosperity was suddenly at risk. The answer? Malign foreign forces and American imperialists are trying to contain China's rightful rise. Any news about the struggling economy, any protest over unpaid wages, any criticism of the government's policies is immediately framed as part of a Western plot to destabilize the motherland. This narrative transforms domestic problems into a patriotic struggle against external enemies. This strategy is brutally effective because it taps into deep-seated national identities and fears. It prevents people from seeing their shared interests. An unemployed factory worker in Ohio and an exploited migrant worker in Shenzhen have far more in common with each other than either of them has with the billionaires and party officials who run their respective countries. But they are taught to see each other as threats. This manufactured conflict keeps the elites in Washington and Beijing secure in their positions, as their populations are too busy fighting the culture wars and nationalist battles laid out for them to notice who is actually pulling the strings and hoarding the profits from the entire system. History is never really over, it just gets repurposed as political ammunition. And in both the United States and China, the ghosts of past conflicts are regularly summoned to justify present-day aggression and control. The deep-seated distrust between these two powers didn't just appear out of thin air. It was forged in the fires of the Cold War and the Korean War, conflicts that left deep ideological scars on both nations. These historical traumas have been carefully preserved and polished by political leaders who find them incredibly useful for rallying their base and demonizing the other side. They provide a ready-made script of suspicion and hostility that can be deployed whenever it's politically convenient. The Korean War from 1950 to 1953 was a pivotal moment. For the United States, it cemented the fear of Red China and fueled the anti-communist hysteria of McCarthyism. This era saw a ruthless purge of left-wing thought and labor organizing in America, creating a political environment where any critique of capitalism could be branded as treasonous. The war created a permanent enemy image of China that has lingered in the American political psyche for decades, easily reawakened to justify new military spending or trade disputes. The narrative of defending freedom against an aggressive, monolithic communist threat became a cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy, a story told and retold to generations. For China, the very same war served an opposite yet equally powerful purpose. The CCP framed its intervention in Korea as a heroic struggle to resist America and aid Korea, a necessary defense against hostile imperialist forces bent on destroying the new socialist state. This narrative was instrumental in consolidating the party's power at home, rallying the population against a common external enemy, and justifying brutal crackdowns on any perceived domestic dissenters. The Korean War became a founding myth of the People's Republic, proof that only the Communist Party could stand up to foreign bullies and protect the Chinese people, a myth that is still central to its legitimacy today. Fast forward to the 21st century, and these old fears are being weaponized anew. The 2008 financial crisis, which started in the United States but sent shockwaves globally, further eroded trust. In America, it confirmed for many that the system was rigged for the rich. In China, it was portrayed as a catastrophic failure of Western capitalism, proof of the superiority of its own state-controlled model. More recently, Xi Jinping's visit to Moscow in May 2025 for Russia's World War II Victory Day parade was dripping with historical symbolism. Together, he and Putin vowed to defend the victorious outcome of World War II, a thinly veiled jab at the US-led global order, casting themselves as righteous defenders against a new form of Western hegemony. Every nation tells itself stories about its past. These stories, or myths, are not just for history books, they are powerful tools for shaping national identity and justifying political action. In both the United States and China, ruling elites have become experts at crafting and promoting historical myths that serve their current agendas. These narratives often simplify complex histories, erase inconvenient truths, and create a sense of shared destiny that demands loyalty and sacrifice. They are designed to make people feel part of a grand, heroic story, one in which the current leaders are the rightful heirs of a glorious legacy. In the United States, the MAGA movement is powered by a potent myth, the idea of a lost golden age. This is a nostalgic vision of a 1950s America that was strong, prosperous, and morally pure, a time before complex social changes and global economic shifts. Of course, this myth conveniently erases the ugly realities of that era, such as brutal racial segregation, rampant sexism, and the suppression of labor rights. By promising to make America great again, this narrative offers a simple solution to modern anxieties. Turn back the clock. It transforms political debate into a crusade to restore a fictional past, a powerful emotional appeal that sidesteps any real discussion of today's complex problems. China, meanwhile, has its own national myth, the Great Rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. The CCP presents itself as the sole agent capable of erasing the century of humiliation that China suffered at the hands of foreign powers from the mid-19th to the mid-20th century. The party's narrative claims it single-handedly defeated the Japanese in World War II, a gross distortion of history, and is now leading China back to its rightful place as a global superpower. This myth demands absolute unity and obedience to the party, framing any dissent or criticism as a betrayal of the entire nation's historic mission. It's a story that justifies extreme state control in the name of collective destiny. The danger of these myths is that they shut down critical thinking. They replace complicated truths with simple, emotionally satisfying slogans. They encourage people to define themselves by what they are against, whether it's globalists and socialists in the United States or hostile foreign forces in China. These state-sanctioned stories create an intellectual cage, making it difficult for citizens to question authority or to imagine alternative futures. When a nation's past is turned into a political weapon, history ceases to be a source of wisdom and instead becomes a justification for intolerance, aggression, and the concentration of power. Behind the grand geopolitical chess match and the soaring nationalist rhetoric, there are real human beings whose lives are being broken. The rise of these dictatorial political styles isn't an abstract concept. It has a tangible, painful cost for ordinary people in both the United States and China. This cost can be measured in lost jobs, shattered communities, and a pervasive sense of hopelessness. It is a story of psychological trauma and disempowerment, where individuals feel increasingly powerless against vast, impersonal forces, and their voices are either ignored or actively silenced by the state. In the United States, the social devastation caused by decades of deindustrialization is profound. For millions of people in former manufacturing hubs, the loss of a job meant the loss of an entire way of life. It meant losing a stable income, health insurance, a pension, and the dignity that comes from skilled work. This economic despair has fueled what sociologists call deaths of despair, rising rates of suicide, drug overdose, and alcohol-related liver disease. The social fabric of these communities has been torn apart, leaving behind a legacy of broken families, neglected towns, and a deep-seated distrust in institutions, from the government to the media, that seem to have failed them completely. In China, the human cost is equally severe, though often hidden behind a wall of state censorship. The country's economic miracle was built on the backs of hundreds of millions of migrant workers who left their rural homes to work in urban factories. Many were forced to leave their children behind, creating a left-behind generation raised by grandparents. Now, as the economy stumbles, millions of these same workers are being laid off with no social safety net to catch them. Their suffering is invisible, as any attempt to organize or protest is swiftly crushed. This has led to widespread disillusionment, especially among the youth, who face bleak job prospects and a deeply hypocritical system, leading to coping mechanisms like lying flat, a quiet protest of passive inaction. The ultimate result of this process is the erosion of human agency. When people lose hope for a better future, when they feel their voices don't matter, and when they are constantly told who to hate, they lose the ability to come together to solve their own problems. Trust, the essential glue of any functioning society, dissolves. Trust in the government, trust in the media, trust in the economy, and even trust in one's neighbors. This widespread loss of faith creates a vacuum that dictatorial leaders are all too eager to fill with promises of order and strength at the cost of freedom and genuine human connection. Imagine you're a terrible magician. Your only trick is making a rabbit disappear, but every time you try, you just accidentally set the rabbit on fire. The crowd is starting to get restless. What do? You point frantically to the back of the room and yell, "Look, a distraction!" This, in essence, is the primary political strategy in both the United States and China today. Faced with deep-seated economic inequality, social unrest, and a crisis of legitimacy, leaders in both countries have become masters of the art of distraction, expertly turning public anger away from their own failures and directing it toward manufactured external threats. In the United States, the distraction engine runs on a high-octane fuel of immigration and foreign competition. Instead of a national conversation about creating good jobs, rebuilding infrastructure, or funding education, the political discourse is dominated by debates over border walls and trade wars. Immigrants, particularly those from Latin America, are relentlessly scapegoated as the source of crime, wage depression, and cultural decay. At the same time, China is portrayed as the ultimate economic villain, a monolithic entity stealing American jobs and intellectual property. This constant focus on outside threats keeps the population in a state of perpetual anxiety and prevents any meaningful discussion of the domestic policies that have enriched the few at the expense of the many. China's distraction engine is perhaps even more sophisticated and all-encompassing. The Chinese Communist Party maintains a tight grip on all media and information, allowing it to construct a reality bubble for its 1.4 billion citizens. Any domestic problem, from the property market crisis to environmental pollution to official corruption, is immediately blamed on the black hands of foreign interference, particularly from the United States. Pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong, a CIA plot, international criticism of its human rights record in Xinjiang, a Western smear campaign to hold China down. By framing every issue as a struggle for national survival against a hostile West, the CCP deflects all accountability for its own policy failures. This tactic is devastatingly effective because it short-circuits solidarity. It makes an American auto worker see a Chinese factory worker not as a fellow human being struggling in a different part of the same exploitative global system, but as an enemy who stole his job. It makes a young Chinese graduate struggling to find work see the United States not as a country full of ordinary people, but as a malicious empire bent on destroying their future. This carefully engineered animosity serves only one group: the political and economic elites in both countries, who can continue to consolidate their wealth and power while the rest of us are busy fighting each other. The constant barrage of fear, blame, and nationalist propaganda has a deeply corrosive effect on a society's ability to act collectively. It leads to a state of what can be called the great disempowerment. It's a pervasive feeling that the problems are too big, the systems are too rigged, and individual actions are ultimately futile. This sense of powerlessness is not an accident. It is the logical outcome of political strategies designed to divide, isolate, and exhaust the general population. When people are atomized and stripped of their collective strength, they become passive subjects rather than active citizens, making them far easier to rule. One of the key ways this disempowerment is achieved is through the systematic destruction of independent organizations. In the United States, decades of anti-union policies have crippled the labor movement, which historically gave working people a powerful collective voice. Community groups, civil rights organizations, and other forms of grassroots power have been defunded, demonized, or absorbed into a political system that prioritizes fundraising over organizing. People are encouraged to see themselves as individual consumers or voters, not as members of a class or a community with shared interests and the power to demand change. This leaves them isolated and vulnerable to manipulation. In China, this process is far more explicit and brutal. The Chinese Communist Party systematically eradicates any and all forms of independent civil society. Any attempt to form an independent labor union, a student association, a religious group, or even a book club is seen as a direct threat to the party's absolute authority and is ruthlessly crushed. The state's advanced digital surveillance network, the Great Firewall, and its army of censors ensure that any organizing efforts are detected and stopped before they can even begin. This totalizing control creates a society where citizens are afraid to speak honestly even to their friends and family, let alone organize for a common cause. The psychological impact of this disempowerment is immense. It breeds cynicism, apathy, and a retreat into private life. Why bother getting involved in politics if it's all a corrupt game? Why speak out if you'll be punished or ignored? This widespread resignation is the ultimate victory for totalitarian power. It creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. People believe they are powerless, so they don't act, and their inaction ensures that the powerful remain unchallenged. Breaking this cycle of learned helplessness is one of the most difficult and most crucial challenges facing people in both nations today. So, here we are at the end of this rather bleak tour of modern political extremism. It's easy to feel overwhelmed, to look at the immense power of the American tech-industrial complex and the Chinese surveillance state, and conclude that we are well and truly screwed. But despair is a luxury we cannot afford because it is the very emotion these systems are designed to produce. The first and most crucial step in fighting back is to refuse to be paralyzed by fear and cynicism. It begins with a simple, radical act, thinking for ourselves and talking honestly with one another. We must learn to see through the propaganda. This means actively questioning the narratives we are fed by our leaders and our media. When a politician tells you that immigrants are the cause of your problems, ask who benefits from you believing that. When the state tells you that foreign forces are to blame for economic hardship, ask what domestic policy failures are being hidden. This requires a commitment to critical thinking and media literacy. It means seeking out independent sources of information, listening to voices that are being suppressed, and learning to recognize the classic techniques of misdirection and scapegoating when you see them. Crucially, we need to rediscover the language of class and solidarity, a concept that has been deliberately erased from mainstream discourse in both countries. A genuine Marxist analysis, not the hollowed-out version used by the CCP to justify its dictatorship, but one that focuses on who has power and who is being exploited, is more necessary than ever. It allows us to see that the true conflict is not between the people of the United States and the people of China. The true conflict is a vertical one, between the vast majority of working people in both countries and the tiny transnational elite class that profits from their labor and their division. This is not a call for a particular political party or ideology. It is a call for something more fundamental: courage. The courage to speak truth to power, even when it's risky. The courage to build bridges of solidarity with people who have been designated as our enemies. The courage to reject the simple, hateful lies and embrace the complex, empathetic truth. It means supporting independent journalism, defending civil liberties for everyone, and joining or forming local organizations that build community power. The path away from fascism is not easy, but it is built one conversation, one act of defiance, and one gesture of solidarity at a time. The powerful want us to believe we are alone, our most revolutionary act is to prove them wrong.